Shalom and welcome to Secrets Revealed, the Holy Bible. Today we're looking at Leviticus chapter 11. It's a monumental chapter. In fact, this chapter has to be its own video. There are 47 verses in this chapter. Beginning in verse 2, we see sons versus children. Make sure I'm in the right book. Okay. Sons versus children. Speak you to the sons of Israel versus the children of Israel. Now, this difference doesn't mean that females are exempt. It simply means that the men of the household were expected to teach these instructions to their household. They were the heads of the household, and to lead their families in adhering to these dietary instructions. Next, we have verse 5 for the next difference. And the rabbit in the Septuagint versus the coney. So the question we must ask is this really rabbit? And the second question is, what is a coney? Because you need to understand that these instructions were not just given haphazardly, to describe every animal on the planet. It's specifically talking about the regional animals in the Middle East, in the area that the children of Israel were living. So isn't a rabbit just a hare? Are they just variations of each other? Similar to saying like a sheep and a goat. So why the distinction? Why are they saying a rabbit and a hare, a coney? What are these? Okay, I'm going to show you a picture. There's going to be the most visual video that I've probably done since I started. So let's show you a picture of what is a hyrax, because I believe that the Masoretic text is actually closer to what the animal actually is. I'm not saying rabbits are clean. They definitely are not. But I believe it's being a little more specific in terms of what is a rabbit, and a rabbit is really a coney. So here's a picture of it. I'm going to blow it up. There you go. So that's this little guy. This little creature is a coney. So what is a coney? A coney is a hyrax. It's also known as the rock hyrax. It is the biblical coney. Kind of looks like a lemur to me, but interestingly, the hare and the hyrax are deemed halal by this group here. I won't say it out loud, but the M word. In fact, the only prohibition in their holy book, besides, I believe, swine, pigs, and blood, and animals that die of themselves. Okay, so halal means it's acceptable for them to consume. So this animal is actually permissible, and that book starts with a Q or a K. They can eat this, but according to Leviticus 11, you're not supposed to be eating these guys. Whether it's a rabbit or a hyrax, they're both unclean. But I believe in this specific instance, it's talking about this animal. When it says a coney, it's a rock hyrax. When it says a rabbit, it's actually talking about a coney. So score 1 point for the Masoretic text. I think they got it here. I think they nailed it on the head, proverbial head, for this specific creature. So out of 41 verses, out of this chapter, which gives specific, very specific, clear instructions, these people here, they pick and choose two instructions, verse 7 and verse 20, I believe, and they throw out the rest for some reason, but that is their, that's the way they believe, that's their doctrine. So I can't argue that. I'm only pointing out this fact. Verse 11, and you have to that's intellectually dishonest if you're really basing it on these commandments. verse 11 says here, you shall not eat of their flesh, and you shall abhor their carcasses. Versus, they shall be even an abomination unto you. Similar meaning, so it's not a big difference. Verse 13, a sister in the faith helped me to notice that all these animals have guidelines. In this chapter, all these creatures have guidelines that you need to look for in terms of specific physical uh, physical properties that they need to meet, and that will distinguish to you whether they are acceptable to eat or not, whether they're clean or unclean. And so I told her, I'm going to give you a shout out. I'm not going to name her, but she did help me to realize this. All the animals have guidelines except for birds and insects. Actually, that's something that I discovered my own, the insect part. So let's look at this. Verse 13, we see here the sea eagle is unclean, but in the Masoretic, they call it the osprey. In either case, they're both unclean. Verse 15, the sparrow is unclean. That is, I don't see that in verse 15 here. In the Masoretic, in the Maz, we have a sea mew versus a sea hawk. Okay. And then hawk is also there. And cuckoo. Cuckoo. So I think cuckoo is not in the Septuagint. And then we see here in verse 16, actually, that's the same. Verse 17, the night raven versus the night hawk. Okay. It says a night hawk in verse 16. So the verses are a little off kilter. They're not in the right order. They don't line up perfectly. And you can see raven is repeated twice. There's a raven and a night raven. So I'm not sure what that means. Perhaps night hawk is a better translation. And then going to great owl and little owl were added to the Maz in verse 17, although they are unclean. Just notable that it doesn't mention them. Or maybe they are clean. I'm not sure. But anyhow, they are birds of prey, and birds of prey tend to be unclean. Verse 18, the red bill versus the gyre or gyre eagle. Okay. I looked up all these animals. Anyway, we're just going to, you can look them up yourself and just prove to yourself, is this unclean? The hoopoe versus the stork. Okay. And then note that hawks and eagles are alike. If you know what they look like, they are very physically similar. So falcons and condors would also be like eagles. They would also be unclean. And so notice hawks being mentioned in the Masoretic is kind of redundant to me, in my opinion. So that's all to do with birds. Let me just close this. I'm going to close this tab because we're going to look at another animal coming up. So in verse 20, winged creatures, when it says winged creatures that creep, does not mean that they can fly. For example, there is a winged lizard, which would fall under this category. And we'll take a look at this. This is a flying lizard. Here's a picture of it right there. The Draco volans. So this is unclean, and it would fall under the category of verse 20 because it's a creeping thing with wings, and it has wings. It's one of the few, the only one I could think of that has wings. That is a creeping thing with wings. So that's verse 20. Oh, what's going on with my windows here? Okay. All right, let me minimize that. So that's verse 20. For example, there's a winged lizard, like I just mentioned. Dragons, although they're labeled as myths, it's interesting that dragons pervade almost every culture, and these cultures are oceans apart. They are even mentioned or alluded to in both the Old and the New Testaments. So whether you believe they existed or not, if they existed, they would be unclean as well, because they are, by definition, like a creeping creature. I'm not sure if they crept or not, but they looked like reptiles, and they had wings, according to the various myths. It's pretty unanimous. It's pretty, I think there's a general consensus that all dragons have wings and they appeared reptilian, and their wings were kind of bat like, and they breathed fire, probably, and they were just very fierce and humongous. So, were dinosaurs dragons? I don't know. It's another topic for another day, but it's interesting to note. And many historians will probably tell you that yes, dragons are uh, labeled as myths, but they are a common, uh, they're a common point, they're a common creature in almost every culture throughout our planet. And these cultures are oceans apart. They are far removed. They don't have any dealings with each other, and they're unanimous that these creatures existed. But now we're kind of pushing them away to be kind of fairy tales and just mythological, that they never existed in the first place. Kind of like giants, where people are saying, there were never giants, but they're finding lots of fossils of these giant human beings. So, anyway, let's move on. We're going into another topic altogether. Verse 22, these are the insects that are permitted, we are permitted to eat here. They are kind of like the birds, like I mentioned before, because there are no guidelines given. There are only specific species. Now, there are 4 identified, and I'm going to show you a picture of each one. I'm sure everybody knows what a caterpillar looks like. So let's just show you, just in case you don't know what they look like. But yes, that's a caterpillar. Okay. Oh, that's very close. Not too close. There you go. So would you eat that? Personally, that's not my kind of taste, but you know what? If I had to survive, perhaps I would. But to eat that, the where's my mouse going? Okay, I'm having some technical difficulties right now. Please bear with me. Okay, we're back. So in verse 22, we see the caterpillar we can eat. In the Maz, it says the locust after his kind, but in the Maz, the Sept, it says caterpillar. It also mentions the Atticus and his like. What is an Atticus? Well, this is what I found for Atticus. It's a moth, basically. So that's an Atticus. It's actually called an Atticus atlas moth. So that would be clean, according to the Sept. Okay, we're closing that tab too. And so that's an Atticus, a moth, and we're permitted to eat that according to the Sept, as well as caterpillars. Next is a cantharus. A cantharus. Uh, Let me just show you them all first before I discuss it. This is a cantharus. Some say it's this. Personally, I think that's probably not what it's talking about. Although there is a beetle that goes by the name of cantharus, a soldier beetle. Once that loads, so that's a cantharus beetle. I'm leaning closer to this being the cantharus. And then the last creature that it lists is the locust. And I'm sure we all know what a locust looks like, but just in case, just for visual reference, this is a locust. That's a pretty big red locust. Looks kind of tasty compared to the green ones. So that's it. That's what they are. The four clean insects that we're allowed to eat according to the sept. But we see in the Maz it's saying the locust versus caterpillar and the bald locust versus the Atticus. So it's kind of redundant to say locust, bald locust. And then it says the beetle versus the cantharus. And I believe this is probably closer to Maz saying it's a beetle because a cantharus, I don't believe is going to be a like shellfish like we saw, like a big slug. And the grasshopper after his kind, and then the locust after. So you can see this is a little repetitive: locust, bald locust, and grasshopper. It's like saying the sheep, the goat, and the mountain goat. I mean, why would you do that? But the sept is very efficient in its words here, saying caterpillar, moth, because caterpillars can become butterflies. Maybe Atticus would include butterflies. I'm not sure. Because maybe that word didn't exist back then. Maybe Atticus was just an umbrella term to include butterflies. And then we have Cantharus, which is beetle, and I think it's probably on the money here for that. And then locust. So locust is separate because caterpillars don't turn to locusts. So there's four right there. Four insects we are permitted to eat. So again, I said it's a redundancy to say locust, bald locust, and grasshopper. They're the same kind. Beetle, it's different than the ones mentioned in the sept, but you know what? It could very well be a cantharus, could very well be a beetle. Uh, so caterpillars can become moths. That's true. And there are 580 types of moths in the Middle East, according to Wikipedia. So they have a lot of choices if they want to eat them. Cantharus is a big question mark since it is a creature that lives in the waters. So, using that logic, uh, creatures that live in the waters need to have what? Fins and scales. The beetle makes more sense since it has wings. However, it would be risky to eat beetle since we need to know without a shadow of a doubt that that is what a cantharus is. And that is what is meant by the word cantharus. And interestingly enough, cantharus with a K in Greek is uh, is a beetle. Cantharus in Greek. Actually, beetle is kolepteros in Greek, but it's very close. What is cantharus in Greek? The Greek word for beetle is kolepteros, so that's interesting. Uh, Regarding what I just said a moment ago, these are what you shall eat of all that are in the waters. All things that have fins and scales in the waters and in the seas, in the brooks, any kind of body of water, these you shall eat. So things that don't have fins or scales in the water, you won't eat. They're abominations to you. So it's not just unclean, it's an abomination. It's very strong, that word. Um, and again, Cantharus lives in the water. It doesn't have fins or scales. So going by verse 9 and 10, we can deduce that it's not that kind of creature, that snail-like creature with the shell. It's most likely a beetle. Okay. Verse 23 is talking about every creeping thing among the birds which has 4 feet is an abomination to you. Okay. Notice it says birds that creep and have 4 feet. I don't know of any bird or bird-like animal that fits this description except for this animal here, the duck-billed platypus. So is this verse talking about the duck-billed platypus? Is it kind of like a little like, hey, duck-billed platypus, but they just don't call it that back then. They're just saying there's this bird-looking creature and it has 4 feet and it looks very comical. And this is an interesting article saying that uh, this is one of the atheist's worst nightmare, uh, because they're saying that platypus is the only mammal with venomous spines, and we don't hear of mammals that are venomous. The only animals that are known to be venomous are snakes, spiders, and other kinds of creatures, usually insects and reptiles and amphibians. They are not mammals, but how can the evolutionist community explain this? Another problem is that platypus lays eggs. No other mammal is known to lay eggs. So this is a problem you'll never hear from atheists. So this disproves evolution because they lay eggs. It proves that this mammal, well, apparently it's a mammal, is another unique kind created uh, by our creator. So yeah, the duck-billed platypus is a big stumbling block to evolutionists, and what a beautiful creature, and quite comical too, I have to say. So let me continue on here. Verse 26, whatever divides the hoof, whichever among the beasts divides the hoof and makes claws or hoof, and does not chew the cud. So they have to make, if they have more than two claws, they will be unclean. That's what claws mean. When it says claws, it means more than two. So let's look at some of these kinds of animals. So animals that have 3 or 4-toed hooves. What are examples? Elephants, they have 3. A roe deer has 2, so they would be clean. And I don't think they're talking about dew claws. I looked this up. I did the research. Dew claws would not count. Uh, they would not be 4. They would be only 2 because those claws are not part of the hoof. They are elevated on the higher part of their foot, whereas the hoof is really the bottom. That's what they're using. So that's verse 26. So cloven footed, right? Verse 27. This is all other animals with paws and not hooves. Every one among all the wild beasts that moves upon its 4 feet, 4 feet meaning the front feet, which goes on all 4, is unclean to you. Everyone that touches their dead body shall be unclean until evening. So that's all other mammals with paws and not hooves. So including cats, dogs, you name it, rats, they're all unclean if they don't have hooves. And they have to specifically uh, divide the hoof, uh, whichever divides the hoof and makes claws and does not chew the cud. So they need to chew the cud, and I believe they need to. Oh, let me just look it up before I make a mistake. So this is where I'm reading it from. This instruction is very specific. Every beast, in verse 3, parting the hoof and making divisions of 2 claws. So 2 has to be 2, no more than that. And chewing the cud. They have to chew cud. That's their food. Among beasts, these you shall eat. So they have to meet those two uh, requirements. But of these you shall not eat. It goes to list, and we spoke about that. So, for example, pigs, they do divide the hoof into 2, but they don't chew the cud. Any pig farmer will tell you they eat anything. They'll eat anything, literally. Uh, they're they are the garbage disposals for the wilderness and all creatures. Kind of like shrimp and crabs and lobsters. They they take care of all the dead, decomposing matter that other animals just cannot eat, or else they'll get sick and die. So that's verse 27. We're going to look at verse 31 now. Verse 31, these are unclean to you of all reptiles which are on the earth. Everyone who touches their carcasses shall be unclean till evening. So reptiles versus creeping things, you'll notice. It goes on to list the mouse and the weasel in the sept of all places. Oh, no, wait. Hold on. Let me just make sure. Where is that? Okay, verse 30. The ferret, the chameleon, the evet. Okay, no, that's in verse 29. So verse 29, it says the weasel and the mouse are reptiles. I'm not sure. It says the same thing in both. Okay, how can they be reptiles? I'm not sure how this. Maybe they're all creeping creatures. Maybe reptiles is a bad translation. It should just be creeping animals. But it's an interesting way to categorize these creatures, not by fur or warm blood, but or scales, but just by the way they travel. So on their bellies, I suppose that mice kind of creep on their bellies somewhat, and so do moles and weasels. So that's an interesting way to separate these creatures, to be honest. But that's the way it is here. I'm not going to argue with it, but that's just how it's listed. So reptiles are different than these animals, I have to mention, because most reptiles and amphibians live in water. Mice, weasels, ferrets, uh, newts, evets. I don't know what an evet is. I'll have to look that up. Let me look it up. Okay. The only animal that came up was a civet. So I'm not sure if that's what it's talking about, a civet cat. But I couldn't find what an evet is. But anyhow, these are all animals that crawl on their bellies. Uh, and they mostly live in water, reptiles and amphibians. And most do not have fins. In fact, they have scales, but they don't have fins. In fact, I do not know of any reptiles that have fins. And no amphibians have scales or fins. So, yeah, you do have some amphibious looking creatures that have kind of fin like structures, but they don't have scales. Most amphibians don't have scales at all, meaning all amphibians are automatically unclean. And so too are reptiles because they don't have fins. And the only land dwelling reptiles are lizards and tortoises that live most of their lives on land, I should say, because we do have alligators, crocodiles that also live on land, but they actually spend most of their lives in water. Okay, all others are able to swim and live in water for short to long periods. So that's verse 31. Verse 34, all food that is eaten on which water shall come shall be unclean versus all meat. So this is more general, including not just meat, but anything else you would eat. Okay. Verse 39, cattle versus beast. If any one of the cattle die versus beast. Okay. Verse 41, this is a explicit, clear instruction here. There are no exceptions to this rule of eating creeping animals. Let's read it. Every reptile that creeps on the earth, this shall be an abomination to you. It shall not be eaten. So if you're wondering, okay, can I eat this reptile or this mouse or weasel or newt or all these animals that creep on their bellies, that travel on their bellies that creep, they go on 4 feet. They are an abomination. It's clear cut here. Verse 44, verses 44 to 45. Here's the rationale why it isn't optional in terms of, would it be beneficial for health reasons? Okay, so let me just read this first before I go on. For I am Yah, your Elohim, and you shall be sanctified, set apart. You shall be holy, separated, because I, Yah, your Elohim, am holy, set apart. That's why you shall be set apart, and you're gonna have to set apart the things we eat too. You shall not defile your souls. You're gonna pollute your soul with any of the reptiles creeping upon the earth. So again, reptiles creeping upon the earth. It's very explicit regarding reptiles. For I am Yah, for I am Yah who brought you up out of the land of Mizraim to be your Elohim, and you shall be holy, for I, Yah, am holy. That is why you need to follow these instructions. And then again, verse 46, this is the law concerning beasts and birds and every living creature in the water and every living creature creeping on the earth, to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, and between those that bring forth alive, such as should be eaten, and those that bring forth alive, such as should not be eaten. So these are the rules. So I've heard this argument or this used as a point from even some believers that, the reason why our Father gave us these laws, these dietary laws and guidelines, is primarily for our health, for health reasons, a nutritional health perspective. From that angle, that's the way they reason. That's why he gave it to us. And so if you break it, you're not hurting him, you're just hurting yourself in terms of your health. But I disagree with this. I strongly disagree. If you want to be a true follower and servant of Yah, this is a requirement. It's not something to be taken lightly or dismissed as simply optional or done to benefit your physical health. Because we just read in verse 44 to 45 the rationale of why you need to set yourself apart, because he is set apart. It is part uh, it is part of being set apart to him, being holy to him, just as he is holy and set apart. This is an identifier. Following these nutritional guidelines is a sign that we are his and he is ours. He is our Elohim, our master, our creator, and the owner of our souls. Verse 47, those that bring forth alive. Notice versus beast. And now I just want to show you a couple pictures here of why it's so important. Recall Peter's dream of the sheet full of uh, unclean animals. This is a disciple, a follower of Yeshua HaMashiach, and this wasn't even a question about these dietary rules. And they weren't simply nutritional guidelines, they were part of their culture. It wasn't even a question that they would follow these. Here's another picture. If it loads, a little cute one there. Looks kind of like childish, but again, these are animals that are very, it's not a question in the minds of those following the Torah, the children of Israel, that they were not permitted to eat these animals. It wouldn't even be a second thought. This was a given. It was just something so easily understood, not just easily understood, but it was so widely spread in their culture that it's not even that they wouldn't entertain the thought. It's unthinkable to eat these animals. So it is very important. It's a very important commandments to keep. Uh, I wanted to make sure that when I covered this topic, I didn't leave anything out and I presented it as best as I could. But I just want to finish with uh, this is very important. This is this is something that is not to be taken lightly. It is something so important to Yah. He devoted a whole section of his scriptures just so we can understand it, and so we would be able to uh, distinguish and then live according to this. I wanted to add as well that even after so many millennia of existence on this planet and all the research we've done into animals and creatures and insects on how they behave, not just that, but their nutritional benefits of eating them, and also disadvantages or the pros and cons of eating certain animals, we're still only scratching the surface. We don't really know everything about all these creatures that are on this planet. And there are even creatures we're still discovering to this day that we didn't even know existed. So the point I'm trying to bring home is what gives Yah Elohim the authority to come up with these rules? Well, number one, he made them all. He made them all. Number two, he made us. And so we just have to believe that he knows best. He's the one who created, and he knows what's best for us, what's best for in terms of how we approach these creatures, in terms of if we're going to eat them or not, if we're going to touch them or not, if, how we're going to how to identify them, how to separate them, and recall that even Noah himself, when he built the ark and then had to load up the animals there, they gathered, they were gathered to him. People like to, they wonder, how did they all come there? They all went. He didn't have to seek them out. It's not like they went on a big scavenger hunt. Said, okay, now I only need one lizard, and I need. Can you find? I'm still missing a female raven. It wasn't like that. They all came. Elohim put it in their hearts, gave them the wisdom for all of them to be preserved. And it says there that of the unclean creatures, they took, I believe it was 2 pairs, and then those clean animals, which were permitted to be eaten, 7 pairs, 7. So how did Noah know this? If this law came afterwards? Well, I submit to you that this already existed, but it wasn't codified yet. It wasn't explicitly written, and it wasn't. They were mostly verbal. It was like an oral Torah that was passed on, probably from Adam, most likely, and then passed down to Noah. But it was only until Moses that it was codified, and now we can see exactly what Adam and his ancestors were upholding, or were supposed to uphold throughout their generations. And now I want to bring home this point that this isn't for Jews. This isn't for only the Jews. It's for Israel. It's for all believers who follow Jesus Christ, Yeshua, because one is not only a Jew outwardly, but one is a Jew inwardly. So you can be born in Israel, you can be of the bloodline of King David, but it's more important that you're a spiritual Israelite in your heart, in your mind, in your words, in your deeds. So that's all I have to say for this video. Thank you very much for your time. May Allah bless you and make your way prosperous. You've been watching Secrets Revealed, the Holy Bible. Shalom.